Hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to our webinar on the challenges and opportunities, clean energy for livelihoods in humanitarian context. It's a big pleasure to kick off this three-part webinar series going into how clean energy can support improving agricultural outputs, business operations, contribute to gender parity, and impact overall community quality of life in disaster and displacement contexts. This webinar is part of a wider webinar series running since 2019, hosted by ICRC, Energypedia, UNITAR, and the CELCO Foundation, and is contributing to the overall global efforts to increase energy access in displacement contexts under the GPA. My name is Amy. I'm working with the GPA Secretariat, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Oh, you could go back one slide for Anisha. Yes, so as I was saying, this webinar is the start of a three-part series, and today the dialogue will look at different opportunities and challenges faced at the Energy Livelihoods Nexus in humanitarian contexts, and will be followed by sessions every 2 weeks, so we hope that you can join the whole dialogue. And the real aims of this are to really share knowledge and engage different practitioners and users of energy and kind of support future project planning, and also assess demand for future deep dives and in-depth discussions on the topic. Next slide, please. So going into the agenda for today, we will have two presentations, one looking at livelihoods opportunities and how energy affects those, and one looking at the challenges of applying this in humanitarian contexts. And then we'll move into a panel discussion with our colleagues in Tanzania and Kenya, who will share their experience on supporting their communities with renewable energy. So really looking forward to the presentations and discussion today. And just a quick housekeeping. So at the end of the session, during the panel discussion, we will have a Q&A. So you can see on the slide where you can post your questions in the chat. And please tell us, the moderators, who you're addressing your questions to, so then we can bring those into the discussion. And so now we'll start off with a quick poll to understand the experience level and interest on the webinar today. So Anisha, if you want to launch the poll. So we're just asking a quick question: in which sector do you have experience in? The humanitarian sector, the energy sector, both, or other? So we'll just take a few minutes to let the poll answers come in. And whenever you're ready, Ranisha. Let's see, great. So we have actually a lot of people with both, so that's exciting. Hopefully a lot of experience to share, some with other, and then some both just working in the humanitarian or energy sectors. So thanks for that. And then we'll have a quick survey that we will post in the chat. We're really trying to understand from the users on this call if there's really a demand to go further into certain topics in kind of a more small group or task force format as we close out the series at the end of March. So if you're interested, please feel free to take the survey that's posted in the chat and share kind of what your needs are or what your interest is in this topic, and we'll get in touch with you directly. So now I'll go on to our speakers. Our first speaker for today is Sarabi, working with the CELCO Foundation for the past 10 years. She has extensive experience in supporting bottom-up planning and program design for livelihoods and healthcare improvements, and she will start us off with a presentation on different options for improving livelihoods through energy access. So over to you, Sarabi.
Thank you so much, Amy. Yeah, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you to Energypedia, ICRC, and GPA for co-organizing this with us. I think we've always found that we want to talk about energy livelihoods in the humanitarian space, but we haven't really had an opportunity to explore it significantly from the point of view of what end users might be working on, what kind of skill sets and livelihoods exist within these settings, and therefore what are the kind of solutions and therefore ecosystems that need to be developed around it. So we felt this was a useful way to kind of open this discussion up, and given the greater interest in productive use of energy, it's kind of an opportune moment to look at our strategies and see how we can all come together on addressing these. Next slide, please. So through this presentation, I just kind of want to set the context for energy and livelihoods more broadly and talk about what are the kind of typical humanitarian contexts that we see and the kind of livelihood solutions that might be relevant in each of these contexts. And then go on to opening the discussion up for other panelists to discuss some of the opportunities and gaps that they see in enabling energy for livelihoods. Next slide. Selco Foundation itself has been around since 2010, and a lot of our work is around looking at inclusive innovation and ecosystem building. And where we really come together is why and how energy and sustainable energy in particular can address both poverty alleviation and climate action related goals. We often find that, these are planned either separately, or the climate action efforts are often focused on mitigation and large scale efforts rather than how it can improve the adaptability and mitigation potential within last mile communities. So the solutions that we look at as part of the inclusive innovation process are really geared towards last mile communities, including individuals, farmers, healthcare facilities, public institutions, and how they can build their resilience while ensuring local area development. Next slide, please. I think a quick disclaimer that when we look at energy for livelihoods and the kinds of gaps and challenges that come up, there's a lot to be said on the clean cooking side, and the GPA does organize in partnership with other agencies, organize sessions around looking at cooking. So this particular series, we're focusing it a lot more on the electrification side of enabling energy for livelihoods. And within this context, there are three or four broad areas that warrant attention. One is in terms of the expenditure and reliability of energy solutions that are currently available for communities in the last mile. We often find that existing solutions, whether those are diesel-based, whether those are intermittent access to the grid for some communities that are able to access that, or whether it's about looking at reliability of these solutions. There's a big question that comes up whether any of the traditional sources, and often that are fossil fuel based, can really address this need. Not to mention the fact that most of these are also high carbon and carbon intensive solutions that have their own implications as far as climate change is concerned. And one of the big parts of all of this are the implications of all of this for local communities, whether those are just rural remote communities or those that are in humanitarian and displacement settings, is the cost that they incur in this process. Livelihoods are often not what is looked at when you look at grant aid, whether in the humanitarian space or in the energy space. And so how do you bridge that gap to enable and stimulate livelihoods while also taking into account the affordability of the energy solution that's available? Another aspect is where how can energy play a role where there are currently manual processes and significant drudgery involved for communities. So the example that we have here is of a pottery community based in eastern Odisha, where just looking at the drudgery involved in the process of operating a manual pottery wheel versus looking at powering some of these solutions and reducing the drudgery involved. And lastly, of course, we're interested in this area because of the opportunities that it brings from the point of view of productivity and income generation. Is there a possibility to increase value capture within the community, whether again, rural, remote, or displaced and humanitarian settings? Next, please. And I think one last point on the need itself, that the larger effort is really to strengthen the resilience and the capacity of local communities to bounce back. And this is particularly relevant when we look at humanitarian settings and displacement settings. In our approach to looking at energy solutions for livelihoods, there are broadly three ways or three aspects to the approach. One is in terms of the holistic system design and solution design. A second is to take into consideration the ecosystem that operates around energy livelihood solutions. And the third is to look at value chains. And this is particularly relevant when we look at agriculture and animal husbandry. And how can you enable solutions along the value chain, whether that's on farm, at a production stage, or, or post-production and value addition. Next slide, please. So when we look at holistic energy solutions, what we're broadly referring to is the technology and infrastructure piece, which is a combination of the clean energy system itself. So the solar panel, the battery, the components of that energy system, the efficient appliance, and we often come back to stressing and emphasizing how important it is to have efficient appliances within that solution, because that changes really the affordability of the energy system and also the applicability in the long term. A third aspect within the technology and infrastructure piece is the built environment. We often find that communities are having to work in spaces that are not conducive from the point of view of thermal comfort, lighting, and ventilation, and how can we address that? And financing and business models, how are these solutions financed, and what is the kind of access to credit that individual entrepreneurs or farmer groups and self-help groups might have to be able to afford these solutions, and how are these solutions owned and operated? Next, please. And around the solution, around the holistic solution, we really have the ecosystem, which is quintessential to the sustainability of those solutions. So when we're looking at program design for energy, ensuring that these different aspects are in place, or there are partnerships in place to enable this. And I think our panelists will touch upon some of these a lot more, and we'll discuss it further in the panel discussion. But whether it's about input and output linkages for the livelihood to exist, whether it's about training and capacity building for the individual entrepreneur to operate and run the solution, or whether it's for local energy enterprises to maintain and provide that after-sales service to ensure the solution can be operated in the long term. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, we look at this value chain approach because there's a way to look at the energy gaps that are faced by individuals and end users at each stage within the production process. So this example outlines the kind of energy solutions that might come in while looking at a dairy value chain. So at the input stage, there is the possibility of looking at vaccine refrigerators, at hydroponics to grow fodder in dry and more arid conditions, and vaccine storage that really provides the resistance against disease and mortality for livestock. And then, of course, when you look at production, collection, and retail, there are a variety of solutions that come up within the value chain that comes up through the needs and the gaps identified, and then we can identify the potential solutions to meet those gaps. Next slide, please. So focusing a little more on sustainable energy, specifically in humanitarian settings, and we did want to keep this first webinar a little more at the energy livelihood level, because we understand there are very specific challenges that come in for humanitarian settings, but we wanted to set the context at a slightly higher level on energy for livelihoods itself and dig deeper into the kind of challenges and opportunities that come in, specifically when we're looking at humanitarian settings. Next slide, please. So what are these typical humanitarian and displacement contexts look like? You know, often we think of just the refugee communities, but there's actually a host of different typologies and communities that come in when you look at humanitarian and displacement contexts. And the drivers may be different. So it may be a socio-political conflict, it may be climate-induced risks and disasters, it may be economic crisis and the lack of economic opportunities. But all of these have resulted in certain kinds of humanitarian contexts. And typically when we look at livelihoods, we look across the protracted time frame. So whether you look at refugee camps and internal displacement camps, where often the need is income generation itself, improvement in productivity, reducing the need to reduce expenditure on fossil fuels that may currently be available, and the reduction in drudgery. And when you look at disaster affected communities, this changes slightly because we're trying to see how communities affected by disasters can become more resilient and have access to local services when they're cut off because of cyclones or floods. Some of these climate related disasters can result in power outages for, you know, between a week to 3 months. How can communities have decentralized energy solutions that can really bring them back on kind of income generation activities soon enough? And you know, the efforts that we make around livelihood development in this space can really build that resilience of the community, so that each time they're affected by the disaster, they're better able to bounce back, if I could say it that way. And we talk about urban slum communities while they don't fit directly into the traditional way of looking at humanitarian settings. There's a displacement angle that also brings a lot of learnings around the temporary nature of the communities, the vulnerability that they face, and the potential economic opportunities that might be there. And solutions that might have worked in some of these urban slum communities could very well be adapted, contextualized, and replicated in some of the camps that we come across. Next, please.
Surabhi, do you mind skipping to the next, just to wrap up in time? Thank you.
Next, please. So, you know, we just wanted to put forth the kind of the typical businesses and livelihoods that we see in humanitarian context, and we'll hear a lot more about this in the panel discussion. But broadly categorized, there is a demand for information communication technology related services, whether that's in basic as phone charging or whether that's about digital services such as laptops and printers. And we're fortunate enough to have a panelist with us who runs an ICT hub. So Vasco will speak a little more about his experience there. Mixed businesses and manufacturing also see a lot of potential in some of these displaced settings and humanitarian contexts, where aspects of refrigeration or tailoring and sewing machines and energy for production could really enhance income generation and reduce that expenditure on existing energy sources. Next, please. And what we do see is also that there is a need for agriculture and livestock related energy services. This may be focused on subsistence agriculture, where you're looking at basic water pumping and on-farm technologies. This may be on livestock, where we're looking at the vaccination needs for managing aspects of backyard poultry, but you also see pastoralist communities and that are often in situations of conflict. And how do we provide solutions for them to be able to look at whether it's, you know, feeding cattle, whether it's then managing the production of milk or refrigeration and preservation, and potentially adding value addition services to that. And finally, when we look at agro-processing and milling, we find that there are existing businesses in many of these settlements that look at agro-processing and milling, but the capacity may be very different from what you see outside. The kind of raw material access that they have in the market, linkage access, is an aspect that needs further attention. Next, please. And I won't go into this. I think I'll stop here because a lot of this will come up in the discussions. But looking at the ecosystem itself, there are multiple aspects around energy livelihood solutions. And we'd like to discuss that a lot more today, as well as in the upcoming series. So over back to you, Amy.
Thanks so much, Surabhi, for giving that background. And we'll go into some of the kind of applications as well in our panel discussion with Vasco and Imael. So thank you. And now we'll move on to our next presenter. And please feel free to write in the chat your questions throughout the presentation, so we have them later in the panel discussion. And so now I'll hand it over to Alex, who is the Global Advisor on Cash and Markets for the International Red Cross, ICRC, and has extensive experience with different UN agencies and INGOs on market-based support. And he'll be presenting on the different needs and challenges of delivering energy for livelihoods in conflict-affected situations. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks a lot, Amy. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can hear you well.
All right, can you also see me now? You should be able to see me. Okay, brilliant. All right, so thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation to this exciting webinar series. So as Amy mentioned, I work with the Economic Security Unit of the ICRC, which is basically the Food Security and Livelihoods unit. My role entails supporting our programs on cash and other market-based interventions in conflict-affected contexts. And I insist on this. Obviously, the ICRC is a humanitarian actor, but the context in which we operate are conflict-affected ones. So in order to do my job and support the programs, a good understanding of the markets and local economies is needed to see if cash and voucher assistance can be feasible to help affected people meet their emergency and recovery needs, for example. In this regard, we typically conduct rapid market analysis to inform cash and voucher assistance, but also more in-depth market system analysis to inform more structural market-based intervention. So the context and market analysis help us identify key stakeholders, including market actors. And something specific about conflict-affected context is that armed groups are often de facto market actors by, for example, imposing roadblocks or imposing informal taxation, or allowing only a specific ethnic group to operate in a certain value chain or in a certain market system. So one of the key findings of such market system analysis is the implication of limited access to energy as a barrier to livelihood opportunities and employment creation. So as you probably know, the ICRC often focuses on supporting the production of different livelihood groups, for example, farmers, pastoralists, or fishing communities. The ICRC is quite known. I'm not sure if it's a good thing, but it's quite known for its in-kind distribution, basically procuring goods, importing them, or procuring them at national level, storing them, and distributing them to affected people when there's a crisis. So for the past few years, the ICRC has been trying to move away from this modus operandi. Okay, and we want to ensure that our interventions are based on a good understanding of markets and are able to use, support, or develop these markets when appropriate. So access to energy is in many cases an enabler for livelihood opportunities and employment creation. So as the topic, energy needs for livelihoods is quite broad, I've decided to focus on fisheries and livestock value chain in different contexts to frame a bit the topic. So the picture you're currently seeing illustrates a vaccination campaign. This is one of the interventions that ICRC is quite known for. Vaccination campaigns, it's a pillar of our livestock support interventions, and it enables us to gain access to some areas that are conflict affected and where oftentimes no other humanitarian actor go, and oftentimes areas that escape the control of the government. So vaccination campaign is a typical intervention that enables us to have access. so that we can interact with affected communities. And this also gives us an opportunity to engage and to establish a dialogue with some armed groups. And here that nuance is important. I'm not talking about a collaboration with armed groups, because sometimes it can be misinterpreted. I'm talking about establishing a dialogue. This is typically an opportunity to promote the international humanitarian, our IHL mandate, so international humanitarian law mandate, and ensure that the rights of affected people are respected and aren't violated. So you can see on this picture, you see these blue boxes. They basically contain veterinary drugs. And this is a picture of a vaccination campaign in South Sudan. And this represents quite a logistical challenge, because you have to bring these drugs. Most of them rely a very reliable cold chain. And the areas where we are conducting these vaccination campaigns are pretty remote. And there are, different hazards that affect the context, whether it's flood, or roads that are cut off, but typically conflict, it's also a factor of this volatility. And a key partner of the ICRC in such programs is the Ministry of Animal Health or Livestock. And a typical support that we would provide is either a bit of budget support, but also some equipment. And in many cases, these equipments are ice boxes, like we see on the picture, or also a generator to power refrigerators. Okay, and that's my segue here. Next slide, please. So I mentioned our focus on the fishery and livestock value chain in 4 different contexts. The first one is Yemen, southern Yemen specifically. I'll be also discussing about our intervention in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, also in Kenya and in Iraq. These are 4 delegations where we are really promoting these market-based intervention and ensuring that we don't substitute the existing market actors, but really support them, and we can reach so that we can reach more sustainable humanitarian impact and reach impact at scale, so that our intervention don't only benefit a limited group of people, but a broader group by targeting and by identifying structural constraints and identifying entry points to reach that high scale. So I'm not going to go into the details here of this market system map, but this is just to show one of the tools we're using to better understand a context. Okay, we try to highlight the specific target groups. So here, that's a market system analysis I led 2 years ago in Aden. The focus was vulnerable fishing communities, including fisher folks, but also women involved in the fisheries. Okay, and oftentimes when we talk about fisheries in Yemen, we say that women are not involved. Okay, it's true that they don't go on boats to fish, but they play an essential role in processing fish. Okay, next, please. So here, basically the map showed the market actors in the middle, the market environment, and the market support services and infrastructure. Okay, and we see typically in the middle, fuel, ice factories and refrigeration. There are essential enablers for this market chain, the fishery market chain, to function. Okay, and we see that they've been affected either by the conflict. It can mean that prices of fuel have increased because of imports, inflation, different things. It can mean they've been affected by structural damages, and that was the case typically in Yemen. And I've put the little green light bubbles here, and this is basically all the opportunities that the constraints in the fishery value chain represent for improving access to energies. Okay, so if we look on the left, fishers with assets and fishers without assets, if we were able, I mean, this is what we're doing typically. We are supporting them with ice boxes, okay, but just ice boxes not sufficient. So we're also trying to look at ice factories, okay. A lot of these processing factories or ice factories, they rely on diesel to operate. Okay, so typically there are opportunities for solar panels there to increase the activities, to improve the activities of some of these actors. And the last point I'll mention here, in the middle you see processing factories. something that is really interesting, and that was one of my key recommendations, was to support these processing factories, because they were very important employers of women in Yemen. Okay, a lot of the fish processing factories used to employ women. So by supporting this specific actor, that could be a nice way to support vulnerable women involved in the fishery value chain. Next slide, please. So here it's a bit small. I'm not going to go into the details, but this is just to illustrate also one of these tools we're using, system analysis, and really to capture the interconnectivity of systems. Okay, the green bubble in the middle, it's sustainable food production in Gaza, and this is quite broad, right? So this is you know, a mind map or a system analysis map that we use to illustrate all the interconnections between public health, sustainable food production, sustainable production in fisheries, sustainable production in farming. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, this is in the Gaza Strip. Next, please. Here again, I put a little, you know, green light bulb, and this is, it's a bit small, you can't really, you know, read it, but this is basically here hybrid grid using solar panels. Okay, and by improving that specific component, we show all the implication that it can have on the broader system. Decentralizing, you know, energy production, that's one of the focus of our Gaza resilience program. And this is basically a program that tries to really understand the interconnectivity of these systems and focus on essential services and ensure that these essential services are resilient when affected by shocks. So we're talking about water, we're talking about wastewater, we're talking about sanitation, we're talking about access to energy. And this Gaza resilience program has a subcomponent called food systems. And within that food system component, there is another component focusing on fisheries. And we're currently about to start, a value chain analysis on fisheries, ensuring we include all this information we have gathered for the past 2 years when we conduct that fishery analysis. Next slide, please. So the first 2 slides were just to illustrate a bit some of the challenges that we have been we've been facing for quite some time. So cold chain, maintaining cold chain in our livestock and fishery intervention, that's a critical challenge. I'd like to react to the point that was mentioned earlier by Surabi. She mentioned that a key role of Selco is trying to identify the energy needs in the different segments of the value chain. And this is what we're trying to do for the past couple of years. This is not yet, you know, standard in our EcoSec interventions. We have expertise in our water and habitat units, and this represents a good opportunity for synergies between our water and habitat units and our economic security department units, trying to understand really the different energy needs in the different segments of the value chain. This is something that can enable us to have a broader impact and not only focusing on the production side. So here is just an example. As part of our livestock/animal health intervention, we also support a lot of poultry interventions. In Iraq, it's a country affected by climate change, heat waves. We have been supporting small entrepreneurs ensure the roof of their the poultry farm is better equipped, so that the heat is reduced within the small poultry farm by typically changing the type of material being used. And we're trying to explore other opportunities to go a bit further, and installing some small solar panels on top of the small poultry farm can be used to also reduce the heat by generating shade, but also these solar panels could power some small ventilators because, as you know, chicken are quite sensitive to heat. And my next slide, please. The picture on the left represents a solar-powered refrigerator, and this is an innovation from Selco Foundation. I presented this a couple of months ago to my colleagues. They found it really, really interesting because this is exactly one of the challenges we've been facing, as I mentioned before. So identifying locally produced and product solutions that are designed for customers with limited purchasing power. So we have a particular interest in these type of solar-powered refrigerator. And on the right, this is a project that started last year in West Africa, and that focuses basically on innovative cold chain solutions, typically green cooling, so that the chemicals used to refrigerate don't contribute to pollution. So this is a very interesting project implemented by GIZ and with funding from the European Union that started last year. And we are observing closely this project to see if some innovation can be used and replicated in some of our interventions. Thanks a lot, Amy. Over.
Thank you so much, Alex, and really for setting the context and also showing those complexities and the opportunities there as well. So thank you for that. And now we will move on to our panel discussion. And in the first part of the panel discussion, we will hear from Vasco and Emael on their experiences in Kenya and Tanzania. So we'll first go over to Vasco, who will share his experience in running an internet connectivity hub. He's a refugee entrepreneur from DRC living in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. And he has a background in teaching and has gained much experience in the renewable energy sector in the past years. He's currently the CEO of Okapi Green Energy, a refugee-owned business operating in Kakuma. And so Vasco will share his experience on running this internet connectivity hub, and as well as the mini-grids surrounding it, which are powering both the hub and also end users in the community. So over to you, Vasco.
Thank you so much, Amy. Let me be, okay, I think I'm okay now. Thank you so much, Amy, for the introduction that you made. As I seek refugees in Kenya, Kakuma refugee camp in 2010, I've been more engaged in vocational training, reproductive health projects. But recently, I've been able to engage a company that's called Okapi Green Energy Limited to focus more on renewable energy. The project has been started since 2018, where we got all our documentation from the government of Kenya. As Amy said, that I've been here for a long time. I've been running a hub where it has only 2.6 kilowatts. And then for the assessment for the hub that we did, we found that the hub has like 20 computer desktop. And we found that most of the 20 laptop, we only use 15 to 22% of the power that we had in the hub. From there, I feel that the remaining power, we can just be able to connect some of few customers to use, so that also we can get some income to maintain the system. From there, I got more application from the community, whereby everyone was like, well, I need to be connected. I need to be connected. So I felt people need to have electricity, because Kakuma has almost 200,000 of population, and they are not able to access energy. So since I engage with the grid, where we only have the 20 kilowatt solar panel, we target to connect 200 customers for the grid, and we have already connected all of them. for the grid. The most important issue is that everyone need to be connected. And remember, we have almost 200,000 people, and the power that we generate is only 20 kilowatts. That cannot accommodate everyone. So we are looking at a way on how we can expand the grid to connect more customers. People are willing to pay for the services that we are giving to them. And each refugee has like a need to have access to the power. And our electricity, most of the people who are using our electricity are people who are doing e-learning. As you can see on the photos, people who are doing online e-learning. They normally come at the center where we have our hub. They do their e-learning there because we never connect everyone to the grid, but we are still looking at a way to scale up the grid so that we can connect more people. We have businesses around, almost 3,000 entrepreneurs all around here looking for the power that they need to power their businesses. So we are still having a very big gap for the energy in refugee setup. Most of the people need to have energy to access so that they can also reach more people. For the system that we only give them, they've been able to engage some people in a restaurant, in a bar, in a hotel, in a shop. They have been able to engage more people because they have already some light. So when we have a light that can come and reach more and more people, for the assessment that we did in the area that we have the grid in Kakuma 3. We need to produce 606 kilowatt hour, and only we have 200. So we are still having a very big gap to reach more and more. As you know, Kakuma sections, but we only focus with one section that is called Kakuma 3. We have Kakuma 1, Kakuma 2, Kakuma 4. All of them, they still need to have access to the electricity, but none of an investors who's coming in to invest in a more scale so that we can people can have access to the power. Since we started this, we really have engaged different stakeholders, and we really get more support from the county government up to the national government. They really support us to have all the documentation to run our business. I'm a refugee, but I'm trying my best to make sure that I can also employ other fellow refugees. So we are trying our best to make sure that everything can just go and have access to electricity, because people are really need to have electricity in the camp. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you so much, Vasco, and really for outlining the demand as well, and how you're meeting that. And so really great to hear you, and looking forward to hearing more about your experience on the panel. And now I'll turn over to Email, who's working with a local NGO based in Arusha, Tanzania, managing different renewable energy interventions and building a vibrant energy ecosystem to improve livelihoods. So she'll talk about a few aspects of her work and their lessons learned. So now I'll hand it over to you, Emael. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ami. I appreciate it. So yes, I've been working with Kakuma, which is a long-standing NGO, and we're focused on improving rural livelihoods using a combination of renewable energy, particularly solar, innovation, and technology. So in the past 2 years, Kakuma has been working on a project entitled Developing Grassroots Energy Innovations for Productive Use and Wellbeing in Rural Tanzania. And this is in partnership with Selco Foundation and SAGOT, the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania. So the objective of this particular project is to improve rural livelihoods, and we consider both the agricultural and non-agricultural sectors. The project demonstrates the use of decentralized energy, particularly solar energy, for innovations that can improve rural livelihoods. And so we expect the result to be economic growth or to reduce the impact of poverty in rural areas. So our key approaches have been in 3 phases: scoping to identify and understand the energy needs, as well as creating solutions, but also ground interventions, which is phase 2, which includes designing the technology and testing, developing the business model, and finally we had the last phase, which is documentation, training, and capturing the learnings. So this particular initiative has impacted rural communities, particularly those who have had lack of access to energy or electricity for that matter. So this would mean we've had this in 3 regions: Dodoma, Iringa, and Morogoro. More details about the process. As I said, we had scoping, and the project basically involved identifying potential regions, districts, wards, for where the proposed technology interventions could be implemented. And we did this using the local government officials. We involved the government officials at different levels so that they can get connected to the end users in order to understand their needs. And then after we identified the end users, we offered them training to understand what kind of solution in terms of solar would be needed to solve their problem. Or so would link them to the technology and energy supplier who would design that solution, but also have enough interest to invest in the technology solution. Then we had the ground implementation. We managed to implement 16 interventions across these 3 regions, and we've done this with the help of our technology and energy suppliers. And what we've done is we've implemented solar-powered egg incubators and refrigeration for poultry vaccination centers, We've had solar-powered sewing machines, solar-powered digital centers, solar-powered irrigation pumps, and also we've had implementation of single-phase rice peeler machines. In terms of the technology design, we've had to do a needs assessment, of course, of our end users to understand whether the equipment that we'll use will be of the right quality and of the right efficiency to meet the needs of the end users. So we brought together different market participants. We had, as I said, we had the local government involved, financial institutions, which include banks. We had our technology and service providers. We also had distributors and equipment suppliers to facilitate these particular partnerships. At the end of the day, we noticed that there was a need to provide consulting, business advisory, and incubation support, especially for those end users, which are entrepreneurs who had early stage businesses. So overall, the project, apart from raising awareness of what is decentralized renewable energy, to increase the income and employment of those end users, and also the economic stance of the communities that we were able to implement these interventions. Kakute also learned about the modern energy services can improve the more informal aspects of these rural incomes and also reduce the daily drudgery or the manual work that encompasses the lives of those rural and poor. But we also noticed that there's a need to help the entrepreneurs to hone their business skills and develop their market awareness. So basically, for more information, I welcome you to visit our website, which is www.kakute.or.tz. Yes.
Thank you so much, Mia. And really great to see as well the concrete applications of the different renewable energy systems and also the whole ecosystem around it. So thank you for that. And now I will turn it over to Surabhi to moderate our panel. We have a few intro questions just to get the discussion going, and then we've been taking your questions throughout the webinar. So please also continue to feel free to send those in. And yes, if our panelists could also turn the video on, if your connection allows, that would be wonderful as well. So over to you, Sorbi, and yeah, look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, if I can request Alex, Vasco, and MIL to please switch on their videos.
I think Emma might be having trouble with her video as well, but she's here.
Fair enough. Emma, I'm assuming you can hear us. If you are able to switch on your video, please do. If not, we'll get started. Okay. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I think maybe I'll quickly start on kind of, you know, at the level looking at energy for livelihoods itself. What is the kind of starting point? And each of you touched upon this a little bit, but if you could go into it, and maybe I'll start with Vasco, you know, looking at the fact that there is a grid in Kakuma. Why is it that businesses are looking at, you know, being part of the mini grid or joining the mini grid? And are there certain kinds of prerequisites that you look at for livelihoods while kind of connecting them to the grid? What are those kind of conditions or aspects that you look at within the business? Is it the skill of the entrepreneur? Is it the kind of ability to pay? Is it the need that they have? What are those entry points for you to really look at this and see whether you want to, whether it makes sense for them to be connected to that solar mini grid?
Thank you so much, Sabri. One of the factors from my side is that in Kakuma, most of the people have been using a generator, whereby they have been paying very expensive. And remember, when they do the connection, they are not well protected. They have they don't have meters to meet a person that you need to pay this amount of money because you are using our generator. So there is no any condition that are really following the factor that we have law and they should follow EPRA condition. So everyone can buy a generator and they come today because they need money. They will say that you have this business. Because you have this business, you have to pay me 5,000. You see? So since I started the grid, most of the people who had a generator where I have the grid, they decided to disconnect their generator. One, because the diesel is very expensive. They are buying the diesel on daily basis. The solar panel, they are here once the batteries they are full charge, they can just run around 24/7. You see? So most of the people in Kakuma, one, they need to have availability for a very good energy whereby they can access for some long time to do their businesses. Secondly, the grid has some conditions that follow the government law. We have to give them a smart meters. And then once the token is off, they can just come and buy the token. So you will see that they feel that the using generator, it is not a deal. So that's why you see most of the people now in Kakuma, they are looking where they should have a very grid, like a very big grid where they can connect more. People in Kakuma or refugees in Kakuma, they are able to pay for the services. It's not only the solar grid that I have. As I said earlier, that they've been paying for, if you have to freezer or fridge, you have to pay 10,000 for a generator, a diesel generator.
Sorry, Vasco, I think we've lost your audio. Oh, it's back. Please go ahead.
Maybe connection.
We just lost you for a second, but please go ahead.
Yes. So, and you see, the most important issue is that people are well, if you train them around, people are well understanding, I have to pay for these services. And I really agree that with this intervention of UNHCR coming with a cash intervention, itself all refugees to do their own decision. If I don't have water, I should go and buy water because I need water. If I don't have 1, 2, 3, I have to go and buy the things that I don't have. So with the cash intervention around Kakuma and Kalbe, it's make every refugee to have a decision to make, to buy, is it to buy a standard solar, where I should only access my electricity, and once my people come outside the class, they can do some recap, and you see. But the grid, it's more very sensitive. When I need to connect a person, I don't check on vulnerability of to pay, because I know everyone is willing to pay. So around Kakuma and Kenya, where we are, with all the studies that have been conducted, everyone is willing to pay for the services. I think I have answered the question.
Yes, thank you. And I think it's interesting because the starting point itself is that people are aware of the need, and there is already energy being used in some way or the other, and there's a willingness to pay for that solution. And if I can ask Alex, based on the experience, especially when we're talking about some of the most vulnerable communities, looking at fisheries and livestock, how does that need get identified, and is there that willingness to pay? Are there existing energy services that that are being provided to these communities, and how does that need for energy itself get identified?
Thanks for the question, Surabi. So, as I mentioned, you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes? Okay.
Yes.
So trying to identify the specific needs of not only vulnerable groups who are often, positioned in the production segment of the value chain, but not, only. Trying to identify the different needs, that's a bit of a challenge, right? So far, we have some expertise in house, but it's not really available, everywhere. And this is really something that we try to mainstream across the organization, right? Because based on the specific energy needs, you can then identify the solution that is appropriate. Is there a solution that is available locally at national level, or should it be imported, right? And this is why I mentioned earlier the interesting solar-powered refrigerator in India, because it's a solution that's been designed with the specific needs in mind, right? With different opportunities to pay, like payment in tranches, something like this. So obviously, in many cases, installing or setting up a solar panel could be the solution to improve the decentralization of the energy system. But oftentimes there are questions related to maintenance, the cost of importing the equipment, the cost of importing the spare parts, and all these elements. So just solar panel, setting up a solar panel isn't necessarily the solution. And as I mentioned, in some of the contexts in which we operate, these are conflict-affected contexts, right? So a solar panel might cost, $2,000 or $10,000. That's a lot of, value, right? So unless you have the community mobilization and all the actors within the community understanding the benefits of having this solar panel, for example, a solar panel to power a water pump for a vegetable garden. That's typically some type of interventions that we are implementing in Casamance, in south of Senegal, an area affected by conflict. So before setting up a solar panel to power the water pump, you have that community engagement process that is necessary, because otherwise there is always a risk that you set up this infrastructure, invest in it, and then that investment might easily be lost if it's affected by the conflict. So that's one element. We've been exploring, for example, some methodological approaches that have been developed, and in Kenya, the International Institutes for Environment and Development conducting some very interesting studies around energizing local economies and trying to see what are the appropriate energy model for different communities, including pastoral and fishing communities. And there were some very interesting lessons learned, and we tried to see how we can adapt and use these lessons learned in some of the recently launched value chain development projects that we have. And one of them is in Lamu County in Kenya. So I'll stop here. Hopefully I addressed some points of your question, Surabhi.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. And I think since you touched upon technology supply chains, and I know MIL and Kakute have had some experience on this, trying to bring it in as part of this program. So MIL, if I can ask you to speak a little bit on, what it really took to bring these technologies to meet the needs, and where was the gap met, and where do you still feel there is a mismatch in terms of the availability of technology and the kind of energy needs that are there in the last mile? MIL, can you hear us? Sorry. I don't know if she's having connectivity issues. Maybe I'll come back to her. I think one aspect that was kind of came out, but would be interesting to know more about, is really what are the kind of linkages that are required to be able to provide energy services and really see them result in additional income generation, right? And perhaps Vasco, from your perspective, also looking at establishing the business itself, what was your experience in terms of doing this and being able to look at providing energy solutions for the communities, and what is the kind of input and output linkages that you see within Kakuma for the different businesses that exist? Are those already established? Are there organizations that work specifically on that? Is there an input that comes from Okapi towards this effort?
Thank you for the question. What I've seen around Kakuma is that where we have the grids, it's like a marketplace where everyone need to go there and establish a shop and have like some businesses running around there. So once he has to come with a business, and you see it's not the owner himself doing the business, it's also employ other youth around, you see. And that's how it make more impact. Then it has result a very big impact in these few years. In last year, October, the only community, they decided to give me an additional land where I should have to develop a big mini grid. You see, they are giving this freely without charging, with the support of the UNHCR, with the support of local government. So you'll see people are trying to make sure that they are also trying to help me to find other solutions, because they have seen that with only these 20 kilowatts, people are trying to engage youth around to make them, you should be my shopkeeper, you should be blah, blah, you should be my accountant here, you should do 1, 2, 3 for my shop, you should just be here recording my items. You see, it really makes sense that without energy, people will fail to do more businesses. So with the energy, it will employ more people. It will give people more access to e-learning. It will give people access to have, those who need to have internet, they will have internet around them, because whatever we are providing, we provide with the access to have Wi-Fi also. So the Wi-Fi will be 24/7 running. So you'll see people will be much busy doing different things at the same time. So we have a very good impact, and that enable a very big livelihood. So far, I'm trying to work on scaling up the system from the 20 kilowatt that I have. I'm now working on to expand another 100 kilowatt, so to be 120 kilowatt, to see if I can connect more than 600 customers to the grid. So it will depend with the design that I will have, and also will depend on the access for the people that I need to serve, which kind of the electricity they need. So I think with this solution in Kakuma, it will bring more impact and engage more youth and make youth too much busy with the different things. That's something I can just say from the grid that we have in Kakuma.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, because that job creation and the local economy stimulation that happens just by having the grid itself there seems to have quite a bit of an impact. And I think the question that I asked Emma, maybe I'll ask you as well, Alex, in terms of kind of technology supply chains and the opportunities that are there in the solutions and implementations that you have done, and what are the kinds of constraints that you face around being able to meet that gap or match the supply of appliances that exist to the kind of needs that are really coming up in terms of scale, in terms of the kind of services and the community.
Okay, thank you so much. One of the factors is that most investors are failing to come in because they have that mind that a refugee, it's a transit where everyone, when you need to invest, you can't invest more than $1 million, you see. And you know, energy, it needs a lot of creativity, it needs more money for you to make sure that you can advocate and have a very big grid. So most of the investors, most of the grant that we are facing, they can only have a grant of 100,000 USD. If that's making sense to reach the gap that you need to reach, that is a very big gap that we are facing in Kakuma or in the refugee setup. So we are trying to call upon on international body, international organizations, investors to come up with a very good focus, how they should also invest in green energy, in humanitarian setup. As I don't know if you heard about Kalobeye. Kalobeye, it's like a very big village where all businesses are like, wow, is this happening in Kalobeye? People are up electricity for 24/7. Now they had only one Kalobeye, but now because they got a very good money to expand with the JZ and the other international body, they are now trying to make sure all refugees in Kalobeye settlement, they have access to energy. And that's something we need in Kakuma. It's something we need in Kakuma, that we should have a very large a number of people who can come in and invest, give grant. Is it a grant? Is it financing? Is it equity? Is it blah, blah? Because as I am a young entrepreneur, I don't have millions to give an auditor report that I have already have a return of 10 million that I don't have. So I have to fail when I'm applying to have like grant. You will say we need to see your record, you need to see your turnover. So we are still a very small company, and we need to grow.
And I think I'm gonna come back to you on that, because we do want to discuss financing as well as part of this. If I can just ask Alex to come in on kind of technology supply chains and more broadly livelihood promotion activities and how that plays a role in this effort.
To the question, Surabi. So I mentioned earlier that one of the tools that we use to achieve some of our objectives, typically economic security objectives, are cash or voucher assistance. Okay, cash can be used for relief, so that a person who's been displaced can cover the immediate needs, but that's also a tool that can be used for recovery, or when somebody, an internally displaced person or refugee, is going to settle in a place for a bit longer, right? So we have what we call microeconomic initiatives. It's a type of income generating activities, and some people who are, entrepreneurs, or who maybe were running a bakery earlier, or a tailor, or they were tailors, or they had a mechanical workshop, they might be able to benefit from such an intervention that is really tailor-made to this person's needs. And part of the support provided might include a productive grant, and that amount will be, could be quite interesting. Okay, so just providing that grant isn't sufficient. Okay, so an essential component of these microeconomic initiatives is to connect the young entrepreneurs or startup enterprises with existing microfinances, for example, who could be able to provide microloans at a later stage. Okay, because a problem that we can be facing is, thanks to the productive grant we have provided, the entrepreneur might be able to procure a fridge, okay, or a solar panel, but maybe some costs haven't been fully appreciated, or a massive shock happens, or fighting, or business goes quite well and there is room for increasing the volume of operation. And our role is not to act as a bank, right? So our role is to connect the people who receive our support with existing market actors, for example, microfinance institutions. Okay, in some areas these actors exist, in others they don't. Okay, so something we try to do, and it hasn't yet become standard practice, but we are promoting this more and more, is encouraging market actors like private sector investors to better understand the needs of affected people. And this is something that Vasco mentioned earlier. How do you attract private sector investors or private sector actors in some of these areas that are often considered as way too risky? Okay, but as you mentioned, Vasco, Calo Bay, people have been there for quite some time, and it's a thriving business environment. Okay, so I think it's a role of the humanitarian actors to demystify a bit some of these misconceptions about IDPs or refugees seen as, beneficiaries and aid recipients, because they are market actors, and our role is to try to identify the needs and how we can connect this. And the risk is for us humanitarian actors to substitute the existing market actors, and this is something that ICRC in some places have to do because there isn't any market actors or they've been displaced, but trying to better understand who were the market actors before and try to identify opportunities to collaborate with them so that we can ensure some sustainability. If we don't want providing the budget support, providing the grant, and if our funding diminishes, the sustainability of the operation is at risk, right? So that's a bit of a challenge, right? And the other point I wanted to mention, an example. I try to focus on a couple of interventions: livestock and fisheries. Vaccination campaign is still a pillar of our interventions, right? We work with national level actors like Ministry of Animal Health or Livestock, but also with community-based actors like animal health workers. Okay, they are a key actor in our livestock interventions. So they will be receiving trainings. They work closely with extension services, and they provide this outreach extension services. Okay, so typically the support they will be they'll be receiving from us is some veterinary drugs, some kits, but oftentimes a problem is to maintain the cold chain, right? So identifying opportunities for bringing typically different animal health workers together as a cooperative so that they can afford some equipment that might be more expensive. This is something that presents opportunities, okay, and we're trying to explore.
No, thank you so much for that, because I think you touched on the microfinance side. You also touched on the aspect of the livelihood promotion actors, the ones that exist, and how we can leverage them to be able to move the market linkage or the input linkage aspect forward. I'm going to quickly come back to MIL, but maybe one thing, Alex, for you to think about is, around the financing ecosystem itself. And when you look at CapEx, OpEx, and the involvement of private sector actors, and I think both of you spoke about that, how realistic is it, and at what stage in that community's evolution or the settlement's evolution do different financing sources come in, especially when we look at energy for livelihoods? I'll quickly check in with MIL if she can. MIL?
Hi, Saravi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know what.
Please go ahead.
But yes. All right. So thank you. Thank you for your question. Well, basically, according to the process that we did for this particular project, or any project for that matter, I believe that it's really important to have a solid baseline research. So it's really key that when you're identifying the needs of your end users or the needs of a community per se, you have to make sure that you have all the key partners informed. For example, we went through the whole process with the government officials, involving them from the very beginning up until the very end of this project. So it's really important that you have your different stakeholders involved in the process. And that means also when it comes to designing the various questions for identifying the needs, you involve them in that particular aspect. But also something that has been a challenge in this particular project, gaps per se. We're happy that we were able to identify these end users, but we've had a few challenges when it comes to our technology and energy suppliers in terms of the quality of equipment, in terms of the skill sets, synergizing both the what the technology supplier and the energy suppliers have in order to create a solution that would benefit the end user. We've had challenges whereby, for example, I will use our egg incubators that we've installed, and our vaccination centers, poultry centers. The ones that we've had for the egg incubations were not going so well from the beginning because there was a mismatch between the efficiency and the quality of the equipment and bringing all that together. So yeah, and also market linkages in terms of financing. Our end users have had difficulties in establishing that connection with our financial institutes who are willing or unwilling to support them in terms of financial support.
No, thank you so much for that. And I think on that point, I can come to both Alex, Vasco, and MIL as well. What are the specifics around looking at financing for refugee communities or displaced communities when it comes to energy for livelihoods? How realistic is it for us to expect that that private investors or formal financial institutions will be able to provide the kind of credit at affordable rates for these kind of communities, and what has been the experience around that?
Maybe I can jump in very quickly.
Yeah, sorry. I'll just ask Alex to start, and then perhaps.
Go ahead, Mal.
No worries.
Sorry.
Okay, so maybe I can jump in. Maybe I can jump in and I'll start really from a relief perspective and how we can potentially transition, because this is the pathway we've been trying to use, right? And I mentioned earlier cash and voucher assistance as a powerful tool to really, empower affected people, right? We don't assume they want to eat rice, so we give them a bag of fries. We don't assume they need a blanket. We try to identify the markets, what are the needs, and try to give them a bit of cash or vouchers so that they access the needs, okay? So in order to do this, we usually work with financial service providers, whether it's a bank, a mobile network operator, like Safaricom or M-Pesa, or a microfinance institution, meaning that some people will receive almost like humanitarian safety nets you know, for maybe 3 months or maybe for longer, depending on the level of vulnerability, meaning that we have established a connection already with affected people and a bank or a financial service provider, okay? So that could be the entry point for a longer collaboration between the affected person and the microfinance institution or the financial service provider, okay? We try to be careful not to act as a guarantor or to vouch for affected people, but ideally somebody who received what we call multi-purpose cash for maybe 3 or 4 months, and then that person was able to receive maybe a productive grant of $1,000 to initiate a small bakery, okay? This can contribute to a bit of a, not a credit track record, but good financial management, okay? So ideally, a bank or microfinance institution that has supported, that has transferred cash to an affected people with our funds, they have the record, right? Okay, this person received $100 for immediate needs for 6 months. Then that person was eligible for income guaranteeing activity. And ideally, the bank could use this to decide to provide a small loan to this entrepreneur, for example. So this is a model we try to use and to harness a bit better the relationship that we have established with this financial service provider, okay? Because in many places we've been doing cash transfer for 3, 5, or more years, and we have established a good working relationship, okay? And we can negotiate, you know, reduce or limited interest rates for specific groups who have the potential to initiate livelihood activities, small businesses that can then, you know, create jobs for other groups of people. And we have examples like this in Nigeria, in the areas affected by the Boko Haram insurgency. We have a collaboration with, you know, different financial service providers, and this is an entry point that we're exploring, among others. But I just wanted to react on this as a pathway from relief to, you know, recovery and potentially graduation approach. Over. Thanks.
Thank you. And Vasco, as both an entrepreneur and part of the affected community, you know, what is the kind of financing that really makes a difference when you look at energy for humanitarian settings? If you could throw a bit of light on that. I think you were alluding to it earlier.
Okay. I think I mentioned something earlier, that Kakuma and Kalobeye, we have some chains whereby we have what we call Kakuma and Kalobeye Challenge Funds. Let me give you an example of Kakuma and Kalobeye Challenge Fund that is doing here around Kakuma. The Kakuma and Kalobeye Challenge, it's the money that World Bank has put here with institutions in the bank. They are using two banks, the Equity Bank and the KCB Bank. Once they have an open application, you apply for you as an entrepreneur to get a grant. That grant goes up to 5 million Kenya shillings. And they have to do some diligence. They have to come and do some assessment so that they can see, is it you or is it somebody who wrote to you or someone from their office who came there and wrote to you the application. So they're doing some due intelligence to make sure that you are the one who apply for the application. So most of refugees here, let me start, most of the refugees here fail for the first call, the application. Because they say, when we can have this money around 5 million and I'm here, I need to go abroad tomorrow. And when I get this money from the World Bank, they'll just put me here. I will not go, I will not have that access to go resettlement. So until when Kakuma and Kalobeye people have said no, because it is 50% for refugees, 50% for host community. They say no, let's have some sessions to educate these people so that they can understand better whatever we are doing as Kakuma Kalobeye Challenge, what we came in with this intervention to make sure that the refugee can just be able to access some grant for free without paying anything. You know, most of refugees in Kakuma, they are not able to access to have a loan from the bank. Maybe 1% or 0% who can have that access to go to the bank and say, I need 500,000 to run some businesses. So because they fail to go there because you have to pay 13%. And then they say, no, the 30%, that's a lot of money. I should have to save and have that money. So most of them, they're looking to have free money so that they can have more access to their businesses. And once they get money, one of the conditions is that I give you money, you have to employ people doing the businesses for you. You have to engage people around you in your community, make sure that they are able also to get some cash from you, from the businesses that you've started. So there is more strategy around Kakuma, whereby it's not only giving you money, but also trying to make sure that they give you some capacity building, how to record, how to do your business, how to market your business outside, how to do whatever that you think you should do. And also the UNHCR is now able to follow up and see how people are trying to grow on daily basis. In Kakuma, we have already, in Kakuma, we have already billionaire who have like 20 people that has already engaged. So that's something that around Kakuma, people are able to do businesses because they are getting money from the institution, from the Kakuma and the Kalube challenges and other institutions that are still coming in. Like recently, we are having WUSC, who's also coming in to give only grant from,
right. I think,
yeah, from 2000. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm sorry to cut you off. I think I just wanted to bring Emma in before we have to close. But I think the point that both of you brought in is really how can grants and soft funding also catalyze businesses, because it's especially when we're looking at these kind of communities, we can't expect market rates of return, and it's critical to bring in the operational efficiency that comes with private sector, but perhaps in the operational expenses, we look at that rather than looking at it as a capital expenditure with a return. If I can just bring Emma in to share her thoughts on the financing side, especially while looking at the testing of technology, how did you go about that process? And that was a question that came in from the audience, but also if you can quickly touch on the kind of financing aspects and mechanisms that you looked at in this pilot. Sorry, I would have to restrict that to about a minute. Emma, if you can come in.
Okay, sure. So with the financing aspect of this product, actually that was part of our second phase. We're still working on it, actually, still working on it without piloting. But so far, what we've done is we've invited different financial institutes and to link them to our end users in the form of hosting meetings, so that they could talk about the finance bank institutions can talk about the type of financing they offer, and our end users can explore those options. But as a lot of the other panelists have mentioned, there is still that kind of a mismatch. We've tried to bring in the thoughts of the bank, the different banks that we've invited, to understand what are the conditions that they need for our end users to access these different types of financing packages, especially those who are in the agricultural sector. But you find that, sorry, excuse me, although they say that they are willing to give access to financing to our end users, you find out that when our end users actually approach them, they're, excuse me, they're limited to accessing those resources, excuse me. So you find that we're still trying to find different ways of linking our end users to our financial institutes. Perhaps one of the better ways of doing so would be still building upon their business models or business cases. That's what we're working on at the moment.
Great, thank you so much. I think that's a segue into webinars that we're going to have 2 weeks from now, which will look at some of these ecosystem aspects and planning aspects in greater detail. I'll hand it back to Amy. Thank you so much, everyone, for being on this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Surabhi.
Thanks, Surabhi, Vasco, Alex, Emil. It's a really rich discussion, and as Surabhi mentioned, we will kind of be going into some of these aspects in greater details in our next session. So really invite you to register and take part in the discussions. So our next webinar will be held on the 15th of March in 2 weeks at the same time. And in that webinar, we will go into different tools that we will that are used for planning interventions, for assessing needs, and really how to work with and for communities to improve livelihoods through energy access. So, and we will also explore some different delivery models and go into those details on the financing aspects of that as well, of how to really make interventions sustainable from the start. So I want to say a big thank you again to all of our panelists. It was a really rich discussion, and look forward to continuing in our next phase of the series. And as we mentioned at the start as well, we are doing kind of a survey throughout the series to see if there is demand for deeper dives on different topics, either looking at a kind of technology supply chain or looking at financing options or many of the other topics discussed. So we'll send around the survey. They've just dropped it in the chat box. So feel free to go there and share your experience and your needs, and we can follow up directly. So thank you everyone for attending, and again to all of our panelists and our colleagues at Energypedia for organizing. And we hope to see you in 2 weeks to dive into different tools and delivery models. Thank you again, and wish you a great afternoon, evening, morning.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Bye.